Welcome back, everyone, to Dungeon Brew, where we talk about all things homebrew. John and I today are going to be discussing dungeon creation in regards to questing. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
All right, everybody, welcome back. My name is Josh. This is John, and we are talking about dungeon creation today in regards to questing. How do you form quests within a dungeon? We have already defined quests. We talked about what those are, so if you need any reference to those, please check out any of the other videos in this series. And let's dive into this because there's probably quite a bit to discuss that we won't even cover in this entire video. John, I'm going to pass it over to you in talking about the biome of the dungeon to begin with, because while building quests in dungeons is a process in of itself, before you actually get into building those quests, you probably have to build the environment and the setting foremost, kind of like we talked about in our world building series.
Right, and I think that the world building series in general, if you just approach it from the mentality of look at this but a dungeon, a lot of those things that we discuss I think are universally applicable. You can talk about the history, the time, like where did the dungeon come from, how long has it been there. You can talk about populations that didn't have inhabited the region and ones that have lived in the dungeon, the current population that's in there right now. You can talk about, if you're talking about keeps or you're talking about thieves guilds or something like that, you can talk about politics. Really, there is anything that you can think of in terms of world building can still apply to a dungeon when you're thinking about the things that make sense for that biome, for that environment, for its importance. Before you can even get into the quest building, that's really where I start, and I know you start, because what ends up happening is that those things help you to inform the type of environment the players are going to be engaging with or interacting with. And what's going to happen is you end up with side quests as a result of that. You end up with those strange arcane artifacts that exist in the dungeon that have a riddle or a puzzle associated with them that nobody has solved because it dates back to the creation of that castle or that keep or that cavern where ancient evil druids used to summon some kind of magic or some kind of evil deity or something like that. All those things create for an interesting atmosphere that ultimately inform the rest of what's going to go on with your dungeon creation.
Yeah, I know for me, dungeon creation just in of itself is a very exciting thing. It's probably one of my most favorite things to do as a DM, and I don't know if this is true for DMs across the board, but just the concept of building that lost, forgotten, or even unique place within a setting, within a world that players can go and kind of get an additional information or lore or something about that world that's just going to bring them deeper into the storyline is very exciting for me. And so I probably spend more time creating dungeons than I even do with some of my world building itself, because I love diving into that environment and specializing it for my players.
Well, and the nice thing is that when you create a dungeon, it also should be informing your world building at the same time. So you create this dungeon, you create this location, what is its place in the world, how does it fit, and then all of a sudden it's like you had to create somebody who, you know, made the keep, or the war that was fought over this castle, or how the thieves happened to inherit this warehouse in the middle of the city and why nobody questions that they're there. All of those things help to inform your world building in unique ways and ultimately help to make the world feel more full and more rich as a result.
Yeah. So once you get your dungeon created, so you created the environment, the location, some of the lore stuff in there, you know what monsters are going to populate in there, maybe what your big baddie is going to look like within that setting. I think it's important for DMs to know that dungeons are oftentimes an amalgamation or an accumulation of all the things we've been talking about in the quest building series. You're going to have open-ended quests, closed-ended quests, possible side quests that are put in there. And they're going to be looking at the different tiers of quest building that we've talked about too. Is there a particular type of quest that you focus on when you're building a dungeon, or does it just depend on the type of setting or the type of world you've already built for your players?
There's a couple of things that I think are almost always included in the dungeon that I create. There is always some kind of puzzle or riddle to be solved. that generally has something to do with the lore or history, like the world building stuff I was just talking about. It usually has something to do with that. While I'm building that lore, I kind of create all of these little snippets of information, and I try to put that together to create some kind of riddle for the party to solve. I pretty much never put that directly between the players and the resolution of that dungeon. It is something that's off to the side that they can engage with if they want to, because I don't like having impediments to the players being able to complete the necessary parts of the dungeon. Those are often side quests for me. So I almost always include things like that. I almost always include empty rooms. I include places where nothing occurs. It helps to make the dungeon feel bigger, and it's more realistic that there are unused spaces, especially if you're talking like a ruined keep or something like that, and those sprawling ones. There are areas that just don't get used, and it doesn't make sense that you have, you know, a room that has 2 carrion crawlers in it, and then the next room has half a dozen orcs, and then the next room has a minotaur, and it just doesn't feel realistic. So being conscious of the spacing and the population within that dungeon is always really important for making sure that the dungeon feels the way that it should.
Yeah. I remember in my early days of DMing that I very much built in the way that you are avoiding, in the way that you're talking. Like, I'm going to put basilisks in this room, and I'm going to have a beholder in this room, and a minotaur in this room, and because they just looked like really cool monsters, and I wanted to play with the monsters that were in the monster manual. And of course, in 3.5, you had a whole stack of monster manuals you could go through for all these cool types of creatures. And I remember those days specifically, and I'll pick on you a little bit, but you used to be like, Josh, that goddamn monster can't even fit into this fucking room. It's too big for your 10 by 10 room. And I would be putting them in this space that they couldn't even fit, let alone roam around in the dungeon. And I've gotten a lot better with that now over the years of recognizing space and theme and recognizing like monster classes and what monsters fit within the same environment with each other. And you're right, having those spaced out and appropriate for that area and having characters go through it, make it feel so much more real and more engaging than what I was doing back in the past. It was crazy. I mean, players enjoyed the fights, but it was not set up in terms of world building and bringing them into those folds. It was just a hack and slash. Let's see what we can find in the next room.
And I did the same thing. I think that most DMs, especially from, you know, before like the modern era where there's a lot more communication, there's a lot more information about how to do this type of thing correctly, I think that they did that. And if you look at the dungeon creation rules for like original or basic D&D, like the Menser type era, they have rollable charts for the way that you're supposed to be doing that stuff, and it really is just random roll to put monsters into rooms. And they did have random roll to like, this room's empty or whatever, this room is unique in some way, but you also ended up with stuff where it's like you had kobolds and orcs and goblins and minotaurs and whatever random creatures all coexisting simultaneously within the same dungeon with that random roll method. And so that's kind of where I learned how to do that, because I assumed that was correct. And there's not anything wrong with it, except for when you start trying to get into a world that does feel more real and feel more natural for the way things are progressing, for the world that you've created. So,
yeah. Well, bringing it back into the quest stuff, so we're not going too far off topic, because this is a fun topic. I do the same thing in terms of quests. I like to add in a little bit of puzzles, a little bit of trickery. I will say that at times I've made those be roadblocks to completing the dungeon, but this is something I've been working on at least in the past half decade or so, of having alternative means of getting through a dungeon or alternative paths for the characters, or if they make other options, having different, what's the word I'm looking for, different, again, roads that they can take based on them having different ways that they can handle things or do things within the dungeon. And that has been received very positively by doing that type of thing. I think that it is frustrating that you as a player are in a DM's dungeon and there is something in your path that requires real-world smarts or intellect or knowledge to get by, or you just have to have yourself be in that DM's head to understand what it was that they wanted or how they wanted something to be done specifically, and you can't find that truth in order to get over that roadblock. And so I think it's really important, like you were mentioning, making sure that it's not contingent on them finishing the dungeon. You can have a little side thing for them to explore and do, but allow them still to be able to complete it without necessarily doing this one specific task in a specific way.
Yeah, I resonate very well with all of those things. I like the idea of multiple paths to the same objective. Choice is always very important when it comes to D&D, and particularly dungeons, because dungeons are such an enclosed space. You can very easily fall into the trap of, especially if you're using like maps that you find or you preach in a map or something like that, the map has a single path, and it's very easy to fall into the trap of, well, I don't want my players to immediately like run through and just go straight to the end, so I'm going to put something in the way and I'm going to make it hard, and then all of a sudden it's like it is an actual roadblock and they can't get past it, and it halts gameplay like dead in its tracks, and all of a sudden you have frustrated players who, like you said, are trying to guess what the DM is thinking and it just doesn't work, or there's a riddle that requires real world smarts that is just not something that they possess. Not saying that they're dumb, but it's like sometimes it's like you just cannot figure out what the answer to that riddle is. And so, like I said, for myself, I put that stuff off to the side. For you, you're talking about saying, yeah, it's still there, but there's always, a side path. There's some other way of getting around it, which I think either of those options are perfectly valid. The main thing to keep in mind is that if you are intent on putting some kind of barrier between your players and completing a quest in some way, whether it's in a dungeon or outside of it, you have to be open to other options for completing those traps or quests or barriers in some way.
I did want to talk a little bit too, because we've talked about the different type of quest types that are in a dungeon, and specifically looking at open and ended quest lines that you might build within this setting. A dungeon itself, I think, typically resonates with being a closed-ended quest. You either have a baddie at the end, you're exploring the entire dungeon, there's some sort of objective that you're meeting within that space that kind of closes that specific quest line, or it leads into your next quest line in some way. One thing that we talked about a little bit, I think, during our open-ended quest lines is that I do use dungeons as a testing grounds to see what my players pick up on and what they like that may lead to quests outside the dungeon, but I don't maybe have a end in mind. So I put a trinket in there or a little tidbit of information. I've dropped a name or dropped a location to see if my characters show interest in that. And then if they do, then I will go and build that later on while they're still making their way through the dungeon. It's just kind of like a morsel that I can see whether or not they wanted to have a taste of.
Yeah, exactly. I do the same thing. I like to plant my hooks in the dungeons, and that's usually my empty rooms. Like, I'll have an empty room. There's no creature in there. There's just scattered junk or something like that. But they find, like you said, a trinket. They find a journal. They find something that gives them a clue as to there's something else that exists in the world. Now, they can choose to not search the room at all, in which case they may not find it, in which case I will pick up whatever that thing is and I'll put it somewhere else at some other point. They may find it. They may look at it and decide that, oh, we're just going to sell this gem. It doesn't matter what it is because for whatever reason they just don't care. Or it may be something where they're really interested and go, oh, there's something special about this. Let me take this someplace so I can find it. And at that point I go, okay, they're interested. Now I can build the next few steps ahead and see if they're actually going to be following this quest line all the way through. I may not know exactly where that's going to go, because like we talked about with open-ended quests, but I definitely have set up the option for them to pursue that quest if they so choose.
Now, I imagine that some of those quests serve as side quests outside of the dungeon. Do you ever create side quests that are just in the dungeon?
Yes. Well, so I'm reminded of one, and this is one of those examples of a quest that you guys didn't end up actually following through either. You guys were going.
We're really good at that.
Yeah. You guys were going through the ruins of Mistamir. You found an altar that had a riddle on it. You read the riddle. You guys seemed to understand some major components of the riddle, but it required that you return to a dungeon at a specific time in order to sacrifice, and you guys were all playing mostly evil characters, so you had to get somebody willing to come in and sacrifice themselves on this altar, in which case you gained a great boon. And at the time you guys were trying to solve it, you were trying to I think get somebody to kill themselves for you or something like that, but since it required that you come back like at a full moon, it wasn't completable right at that moment, and I think what ended up happening is you guys just forgot about it. So I think that that's a self-contained quest. Like, it occurred within the dungeon. Technically, you had to come back to the dungeon at a different time and date, but ultimately it was completable within the dungeon. And there are a few like that I do. I like to do usually the riddles and things like that I talked about a little bit ago are usually completable within the dungeon itself. You don't need anything else outside of the dungeon. So long as you solve the riddle, then you complete the quest, and if you complete the quest, then you get whatever the reward is for completing that quest. It may just be experience. It usually is something else involved, but I try to keep some of those things self-contained as well.
Yeah, I'm. What comes to mind for me is the different dungeons within the Baldur's Gate 2 Shadows of Amn game. Specifically, when you're going and fighting the Shadow Dragon, and you're going through this long dungeon with lots of riddles and lots of side pieces to do. But there's also stuff within there where it's like, bring this shadow across the letters to the other side and free him type of thing. Which that, of course, ends. Spoiler alert, that ends negatively. But I like to put things like that in my dungeon too, where it's seeing whether or not the party will rescue this spirit, rescue this evil entity, rescue even captured individuals within that dungeon. I had one that I did not long ago where you guys were rescuing... well, I don't even know if you were part of this campaign, actually, but they were rescuing trapped citizens underneath a citadel and getting them out. Maybe you were part of it. And they were just getting them out in different rooms. They had to find all the citizens to let them be free. They didn't have to do that, but it was a side quest that was within the dungeon that was between them and the big baddie that they were fighting at the end. So things like that I like to incorporate, where there are little side things that you can do for additional experience, but they aren't necessary for completion.
Right, and those are good examples of like social quests. Finding something or finding someone, whether it is a spirit or an actual person or something along those lines, finding them, interacting with them socially, and then solving their problem. Ghosts are really good for that. I had a couple of those that I think that I've done recently where you guys interacted with a banshee that didn't necessarily have to end badly, but I think Warden specifically provoked her into violence. And then I think there was a ghost as well. There was a ghost in... you guys were in Rail, it was in the same area actually, but there was a ghost that wanted proof of her child's her child having escaped from the town before it was attacked, and you guys were able to find that proof and put that spirit to rest. So both of those things were social encounters. One of them ended in combat based on how you guys chose to do it. The other one did not. So I think that those types of quests are very good for offering social encounters or social quests that offer other types of resolution, and the outcome is dependent upon player choice and player interactions on a social level.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, the final piece we want to talk about here is that, you know, there are different types of quests that you can formulate, but there's also different tiers that you have that exist within the dungeon too that you may be coming up on. We've talked about this a lot in our other videos about how we look oftentimes at quests as being combat, social, or exploration, and any of those types of quests can have other encounters that are included within those. When I look at dungeons, I oftentimes do perceive them in that way. As a DM, do I have an objective set for my players to come into this dungeon as it being like a social dungeon that's going to have combat and exploration quests? Is it going to be a combat dungeon that's going to have social and exploration quests? Or is it going to be an exploration dungeon that's going to have combat and social encounters? I think I need to say encounters before then, but you get the point.
Yeah.
Does it include all those aspects? And as a DM, what's my objective? Why am I creating this dungeon? What's its primary focus?
Right, and I think that actually is a really good point to end on here, is what the focus of your dungeon is. And I think that combat dungeons are pretty self-explanatory. You're going in there to kill the big bad who's holed up in there. It's his lair. It's a dragon or an ogre or whatever. Those as dungeons are normal to us. Exploration dungeons are the same way. There is this mysterious ruin. Go explore it. That's it. That's all you need to do. You discover, or there is a dungeon that exists out there somewhere. Go find it. Find out what it's about. That's a discovery. It's exploration. Those things are native. They make sense. Social dungeons I don't think are quite as common or quite as natural, but if you think about them, they really are. And I'm going to let you talk about this, because this, I think, is something that you explained to me really well, and I really like the idea of a social dungeon.
Yeah, so we don't talk about social dungeons a lot, but if we want to determine what a dungeon is, it's oftentimes just one location. It's one kind of a set location that's within a world that is there for exploration or for your characters to go through. And if you think about it in terms of large cities, like right now we're doing Hawkhurst, which is a setting that has many establishments throughout that entire world where players can go and explore multi-leveled establishments, whether it's the Thieves Guild, the Bards Guild, or the Hunters Guild. There's multiple places there where they can go and explore and engage with people within those settings. Mm-hmm. And for the most part, they're engaging in those from a social aspect. They're building alliances, they're building connections, they're forming relationships. We see this with the military ward, or even some of the particular houses that are full of guards and individual guys. But if they get on the wrong side of those, it could very well turn into a combat situation, or another type of encounter, which we've seen many times in gameplay, where you're going and you're taking out the Thieves Guild. You're going in and you're fighting, you're looking for the Master Thief, and you're bringing him to ruin. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't necessarily have to be, because that is a social dungeon. You may go in there and make an alliance with the Master Thief, or work with his people, or even do quests for them for quite a while. You know, you could spend your levels 3 through 6 and working with the Thieves Guild, and then come level 7, something turns and now you're moving back into that stronghold, or into that singular location that's confined, and you're fighting them, and it's now become a combat place where before it was a social dungeon. So that's how I think about it. It's not necessarily this ruin, this cave, this lost palace that you're having to go and explore. Dungeons can also be a confined location for a social establishment that your characters are engaging in a regular basis, that may at some point become a dungeon that they're working through and having to achieve another mission through there outside of just connection or alliance building.
Yeah, and I really like the idea. I think the most obvious example of it is the Thieves Guild. That makes sense intuitively, and I think from that basis, I think that you can build out into other options. But the Thieves Guild infiltration, so that you're trying to work your way in there and gain favor with the Thieves Guild, whether that's intrinsically because you're interested in allying with them, or because you're interested in overthrowing or betraying them in some way, it begins as a social quest with a social dungeon in which multiple quests can be had. You can find the same queues for open-ended quests where you loot in one of the thief lieutenant's rooms, and you find this note that leads you onto this quest line that you didn't expect to find. You can have internal quests where you find these locks or these riddles that allow you to solve puzzles and get rewards as a result of that. All of the things that you normally would find in a dungeon can still be found in that location. You can have brawling options, you can have sparring sessions, you can still have combat, you can still have those things. You can have social encounters with thieves who are bullies and bastards, and those end with combat encounters as well. The point is that that social dungeon can contain everything that the exploration and combat dungeons contain as well, and it can just be a really new spin, a really good way of looking at those that I think is hugely beneficial to a DM trying to liven up that type of play in their sessions.
Yeah, a really good example of this, and hopefully this fits well here, but I'm thinking again of video games that you may play, is Skyrim. Skyrim has a variety of social dungeons for you to explore and engage with and ally with, and then eventually the coin flips and now you're on the opposite end and you're going into those same locations and battling the people that were your friends, levels prior. And when I think of social dungeons, I think that game does an excellent job of setting up what that can look like and how you can replicate that in your own gameplay in TTRPGs.
Yeah. All right, so this is going to be the culmination of our quest building series. We have gone through open-ended quests, side quests, close-ended quests, social quests, exploration quests, and combat quests. if anybody has any other options or anything else they want us to talk about as it relates to quests, we're more than happy to continue talking about this. I think our plan is for our next video to talk about trap making and trap building and traps in general, and after that we're going to see what's available for us next.
Jon